Okay, thank you very much for that. Before I open up the questions, I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that myself and Neil McEnroy and others were part of a group that did a paper for John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn, and that went to what was then the Shadow Cabinet. And out of that came the Community Wealth Building Unit and the doubling of the co-op enterprises. And there's still, I think, relevance in those documents in terms of a memory, at least, as to what we did, why we did it, and what happened. Because I'm always interested in notable, not just best practice, and learning the lessons of where things went awry. Always useful for not making the same mistake.
Excellent. Okay, I was just going to send you to the other email address, so instructions to get in, but you're okay.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Give them my best wishes. See you soon.
Yeah, I know.
Bye.
And the other thing I'd like to commend is the fair care model for social care, which is premised on the idea of, instead of outsourcing, that the local authority acts as a secondary co-op, because the law comes in 3 flavours, like Neapolitan ice cream: can do, can't do, must do. And you cannot let out those responsibilities. That's why the contracts are so worried about risk, is because the risk is always with the local authority. So working out how we can ameliorate the risk and make sure that local authorities have got an eye on that and feel secure in that, and then can act as a secondary co-op, so that you let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yeah,
it's kind of where I've been focused on the work I've been doing with other cooperators. So I'll shut up now and open up for Q&As. You've been silenced into submission.
Cheryl, we have a question from Adrian Ashton. How might the existing bid infrastructures offer pathways into this model for local areas? That's from Adrian.
I think that's a very interesting idea, Adrian, because really all we're describing with the thin layer model, it is that really that's a sort of a blank canvas in a way to provide a set of rules for how different organizations will work together and allocate surplus over time. So where you've already got some established relationships, organizations that already have a sort of set of shared objectives, stitching that into a cooperative like this, where you've got the potential to include local authorities in the membership, you've got the potential to include other landowners in the membership. You start to be able to transact within the governance of that membership, rather than then having to resort to contracts and procurement and things like that. So I think it's a very interesting idea. And are there particular areas that you had in mind there, Adrian?
Not off the top of my head, but I've been fortunate to be invited to work with a couple of bid management teams over the last few years.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me is that, so bid, by the way, is a business improvement district model, for those who aren't aware, introduced a few years ago. So the idea being that businesses in a high street town centre vote to pay an additional amount of money, so the businesses raise their own investment themselves to fund this collective programme of work to support the regeneration and upkeep and safety of that whole area for their mutual benefit. So there's kind of, you describe it that way and you kind of go, well, there's a kind of a quasi co-op ethos there already, and it brings in local authorities, landowners, as Simon says. Like I said, one of the things I've noticed over the last few years is bid areas seem to be increasingly thinking about or interested in exploring, how do we make it more relational and less transactional in terms of embedding this. So it's not something we have to go around every couple of years and get everyone to say, should we continue it or not? They're trying to find ways to say, how can we now really kind of cement this in and protect it for future generations? So like you say,
really
so I think it's just, there's things happening out there, and it's just conversations like this are great in just helping us to surface them all together and just to kind of then build on it after today to follow through on those threads and try and
Yeah.
conversations
Well,
with
yeah, I
them.
mean, just to flag, so we'll be publishing an article on this in early June, which will sort of spell it out in a little bit more detail. But I think the bid idea is, you know, it feels like quite a good fit for it. And really, what this is a framework for collaboration that is principles and values and purpose based, rather than what we tend to try to do, which is to kind of govern things through contracts. And you know, fundamentally a contract is a sort of adversarial agreement that's, you know, ultimately there's the threat of enforcement sitting over a contract that sort of sets the terms, that allows sort of power imbalance to be entrenched at the points of contract signature. So you know, when you're talking, Adrian, about relational, moving from a sort of less transactional to a more relational thing, using cooperatives as the governance layer rather than necessarily as a sort of discrete organization, you know, this is a potential framework for collaboration that I think has a lot of applications. So yeah, really interesting. Glenn.
Hey, thanks, Simon. Yeah, just a quick one in terms of, I think there's a worry within Pride in Place that we don't get any cooperative endeavour at all. I mean, it's been led by elected officials and then the local authority, and if they don't get it. And I know I went to a recent meeting with the co-op development bodies across the UK, and they were very disheartened actually in terms of the flow of resource coming from UK government via the doubling of the co-op sector. And really, this money is kind of the only game in town. So what can we do as a movement, I think, to influence local management and for those people to get that this isn't about you know, putting the new benches in the high street, putting new plants in planters, because that's all lovely, but we've seen all that before and it doesn't actually change anything. So how can we influence those policymakers that are not thinking about cooperatives, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, and I think it's a really big one. I think there's a job for all of us in the movement. You know, I think having worked in local authorities, you know, I think there's something that we as cooperators often forget is that people don't quite understand why any of this is important, right? So, you know, if you're thinking about a disenfranchised neighbourhood that might be receiving Pride in Place in a local authority that doesn't necessarily subscribe to these sorts of models, where would the idea even enter? And so I think there is a real job for the movement in making sure that these ideas are understood and their benefits are really understood, and that's central. You know, I think in policy terms, there's more than enough hooks in the Pride in Place guidance for these things to be absolutely central to the way that these programs come forward. There's a very useful recommendation that by year 3, neighbourhood boards should be replaced by community benefit societies or you know, genuinely sort of collectively governed organisations. But I think there's now a big job on everyone working in this space to be able to land the ideas and to be able to support. There's a big risk, I think. You know, we're at the moment looking at tenders for the sort of support framework around Pride in Place. Not quite sure what details going to come in, but you can bet that the PwCs and the Deloittes of this world will be swooping in with very shiny offers and that sort of thing. So I think, you know, how can we as a movement kind of collectively come up with a really solid offer where we're all bringing particular sort of angles? I think that's a really important step.
Simon, before I bring in Nick, is it worth having a coalition of the willing that we provide an oversight, that we volunteer to have an oversight to this, and then we intervene when necessary? And if there's a few of us, we could ask the right person to do an intervention, you know what I mean? Just to try and keep it on track as best we can.
I think there's something in that, absolutely. And I think, you know, we're all probably having different conversations with the partners and the networks that we're engaging with. So I think there's just something about, you know, where do you go for the progressive advice on this stuff? There's an interesting conversation that started within the Cooperative Council's Innovation Network that they they were thinking about, could they provide some sort of cooperative placemaking network that is very much squarely aimed at their members who have pride in place neighbourhoods, so that these progressive ideas are very much front and centre. I think they're probably still, responding to the local elections. There's probably quite a lot of change in their compositions, but I think that's very much a watch this space. I mean, they talked about a sort of pride in place network that I think a lot of organisations here will be affiliate members of the CCIN, and that could be a place where you can very much sort of articulate what a progressive cooperative placemaking offer would look like, and partners can kind of agree who's best placed to respond where and who's got the relationships and so on. So I think it's an evolving space. I have a lot of sympathy for local authorities in this. This has sort of landed slightly unexpected. Their sort of reflex response is to go with what they know, which is sort of property-led regeneration. We've been doing this for a long time. So the institutional muscles kind of, the reflex response is to go in that direction. So I think we have a job to do to make sure that this stuff is understood and coming in at the right time. But yeah, I definitely share some of the concerns as well.
Thank you, Nick.
Is my camera on? So I was just curious about you could talk more about the practicalities of using co-ops as a kind of governance structure. So am I right in understanding that this would be kind of in the form of a secondary cooperative between different people involved? And do you imagine the primary co-ops, if I've understood that correctly, as also being cooperatives? It's interesting. I've been involved in a project in Birmingham and Sturchley of a kind of secondary co-op between housing co-op and several worker co-ops, building a new build to host social housing, and the worker co-ops in a more secure tenancy on our high street that they've been present in for the last 10 years. And that's both been that's been a really good model in terms of bringing different things together, but it's faced a lot of challenges in terms of being able to access institutional finance. So it took a really long time to be able to secure the status of a resident provider of social housing, to allow us to offer the places to people on the council tenancy list, which is something we really want to do, and to secure funding that was tied to that status from Homes England.
Yeah.
Which the kind of difficulties that people not being familiar with the cooperative model created, us having to partner quite close with the local housing association, which was going really well for a long time, but at the very last minute, as the new build is coming towards completion, they're kind of pulling the rug onto us at the last moment and trying to pass on a load of the costs that they've accumulated through, frankly, mismanagement of the parts of the project they were doing. And it's kind of raising the price on the final sale of the building. It's kind of putting the whole project in significant jeopardy. So I just wondered if any thoughts on that, and also just
that's really interesting, and I think so one of the super interesting things about CNI, and I think this is almost unique in a UK context, is that actually local authorities are members of the cooperative. So they are equal participants in the governance of the cooperative. So alongside Virgin Media, alongside B4RN, the community broadband provider, and so on. And so what the cooperative governance does is mediates between those interests and neutralizes the potential for anyone to extract value from these transactions. So in legal terms, they are transacting as cooperative acts. They're not transacting, they're not participating in market transactions. So I think in some ways that gets around, were you to apply that to a sort of a neighborhood development level, that gets around some of the issues you're describing, Nick, of sort of you know, a local authority then coming back round and sort of saying, well, you know, we're going to nail you for these costs or those costs, because you have relational governance that is addressing these things as things move. So it is collectively making decisions, and the cooperative is collectively responsible for the decisions. You're not sort of in that adversarial position. I mean, it sounds very implausible, but in fact, you know, Virgin Media participate in these conversations with the local authority and agree not to monopolize the asset in the CNI context, and so that there is something, and I think this is a sort of a novel structure in a way. It's not primary or secondary. It's something else. They've called it a thin layer cooperative, but it's essentially using the cooperative as the governance, as the sort of shared set of regulations that has a sort of a quasi sovereignty of its own. So it's sort of answerable to the shared purpose. And so in a neighborhood development context, the shared purpose might be developing the neighborhood for the benefit of the people within the neighborhood. And whatever the cooperative chooses to do within its governance, you know, to further those objects, it is perfectly entitled to do, and that can mean moving money from one partner to another, or you know, whatever else. So it just strikes me that this has the potential to move things into a slightly different set of relationships that really don't tend to feature in the neighborhood development context, and a lot of you know, the ways in which local authorities kind of habitually relate to organizations outside of themselves as well. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'll share the article. We're doing a follow-up article that goes into a bit more detail on this, so I'll definitely circulate that. But Chris, David.
Thank you very much. I'll share a comment from Gwentley Evans from Cumney Bro. She says she agrees with Glenn that very often allocation, and I presume she means allocation of finance and financial support, has happened in many areas in Wales with no engagement or very little. But I'm going to then just move, you can comment on that, but I'm going to move on to Yvonne Murray, who says, hi everyone, I am Yvonne Murray from Oh My Days Productions. There you go, free advert, for creator of The Talking Shop. And I'm here today because I'm wondering if we're going to talk about how creatives and artists can transform declining high streets. Bringing artists and creatives into an area is highly cost-effective urban regeneration strategy because it activates dead spaces, curates a unique cultural identity, and attracts lucrative private investment. This dynamic creates significant footfall and neighbourhood appeal without requiring massive upfront public infrastructure spending. The redevelopment of King's Cross, London, is frequently cited in urban planning as a prime example of this. The blueprint for using artists and creatives to transform the area, shifting it from a derelict, crime-ridden district into a prime destination, serves as strong evidence of the strategy's effectiveness. She may want to comment further, but perhaps I'll hand over to you, Simon, and see what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, it 100% resonates. And yeah, I mean, having been to the King's Cross development, it's a very impressive example of urban regeneration, and I can absolutely see. I think there's an interesting, you know, there is also an interesting, you know, I suppose you could look to Hackney, where, you know, there's a sort of a gentrification arc that often happens in these contexts, where you will start with, you know, the creatives and the artists moving in because, you know, they're looking for cheap rent and places where they can afford to live and be creative, and that then creates a sort of a sense of cool, which then, you know, draws in private capital, and then you end up with a situation now where we have somewhere like Shoreditch, which is far too expensive for any of us to live, and has to some extent lost some of that creative edge or creative cool. So I 100% agree with the principle that stimulating the life of a neighborhood it really benefits from the presence of creatives and artists. I guess my concern is when that becomes a sort of a lever for or a kind of precursor to private extraction. It's sort of, how do you then resist the extractive forces of capital coming in and sort of swooping in and taking the gains of that, and that's where I think new legal structures or instruments, ways that sort of prevent extraction at the outset can be really powerful. So 100% agree, just with certain caveats as to who ultimately benefits.
Thank you, Chris.
Lovely, thank you. It's clearly you're referring to a tension very much about, because there's always going to be big chains in the high street, and then there's going to be more local and private shops. To what extent do we ever have a manage control over the whole lot, or do we just accept we try to control part of it? And then finally, with these best features that you're referring to, there's the issues of energy and finance. You need both. And so does that naturally go beyond Pride in Place? Or in other words, is Pride in Place some sort of a Kickstarter, and then we have to find some way to move on from there and perhaps do it locally?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I'm just sort of digesting all of those aspects, but I think, I mean, the thing that came to mind was Gale's Bakery. I don't know if people know their model, but they're very much a sort of private equity backed firm. Have a model that essentially they look at which independent shops on a high street are doing well. Once they see a tipping point, they move in, they buy the place next door, and so they're waiting for the sort of gentrification sweet spot. They buy up an asset, they bring in put a cafe in there. The interesting thing is that once Gales go in, then other large corporate firms take that as a signal that, okay, this place is on a gentrification tipping point. Now we need to flood the high street. And at that point, you suddenly see this tipping point where a high street ceases to become independent and locally owned. It goes back to the ownership point, I think. And I think this is where Pride in Place is an opportunity. As capital funding, there is an opportunity there to acquire and safeguard through community land trusts or whatever instrument, in order that kind of vulture capitalism can't swoop in and shift things. If you want these things to be maintained, we really need to look at ownership. We really need to be able to find ways to protect local assets from that sort of acquisitive, extractive, those forces. So I think community ownership, asset locks, these are all really useful mechanisms for preventing that. Yeah.
Gavin.
Thank you. I'm here from Ruthin, and I've been involved since 2009 in lots of projects with a place plan, etc. We've had a lot of success, and I've currently got about 12 million being invested in and around the town. But I'm a town councillor, and I've driven that project, but I'm involved in terms of how do we get people discussing and working together. In Ruthin, the experience is there's a lot of the same faces all working terribly hard. And then the interest I've got in terms of the cooperative model is how can, when I step down or when other people step aside from what they do, what model is there that can really actually strengthen the structures that are making things happen, but currently on a kind of an informal cooperative basis, people just working together and wanting the same ambition, and how a cooperative model can actually take out the reliance on personalities and individuals and see the strength of something, because we have built something very positive and it is delivering, but it's how do you make sure that that's embedded in the community and we benefit from that on a longer term.
Yeah, no, really interesting, Gavin, and I think I mean, we're still seeing some of the detail come through, but the new devolution and community empowerment bill, is it has put in a requirement for neighbourhood boards. Now, you know, that might be one way in which you can have a sort of a local institutional layer that can safeguard these principles. It will be very interesting, you know, and I think there's a job on all of us to make sure that those things aren't just a sort of, you know, top-down prescribed thing. I think that's very much the way that it reads in, you know, through the sort of MACLG, the Westminster lens, is to think, okay, you know, what's the size of one of these things? How many people are in a neighborhood, and so on. And you sort of get this quite cookie cutter approach, which doesn't really build on those sort of existing local muscles. But I think you're absolutely right that you want to, those things can't be reliant on the enthusiasms of one or two individuals. They have to very much be a shared endeavour. And so I think building cooperative principles, cooperative values and principles into those governance structures is a very important step. I think the idea of open and voluntary membership of things, these are really good, sound principles for designing those things. I think the Mayoral Development Corporation in Rochdale is definitely one to watch here. I think there's a lot of political will there to really look at how do you embed cooperative values and principles into the decision making and the ongoing governance of development and regeneration in Middleton. So yeah, I think that, you know, we're learning, we're sort of looking for examples. I think I'd also say let's try not to just do the cookie cutter thing of saying, you know, 5,000 people in a neighborhood, okay, let's carve the map up and give each one of those a neighborhood governance. That's not really how places work. So it has to operate at a sort of at a scale that people understand what their neighborhood is, and that's just quite a personal thing. But yeah, no, thanks, great question.
Yvonne?
Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for reading out my comment in the chat. I just wanted to pick up on your response, Simon, to I totally agree about community ownership. In Wales, we have a massive problem. As someone who's been taking over empty shops for the past 10 years, a lot of the shops are owned by either people who don't live in the area, or don't live in Wales, or don't even live in the UK. So it is a massive problem. But I just wanted to say there is a big difference between the King's Cross development and Shoreditch. So Shoreditch and other places, which, you know, we can name quite a few, where they're you know, the places are almost derelict and artists move in because no one else wants to move in, and therefore that becomes gentrified. What you described there is very different to the King's Cross strategy, which embedded creatives and artists and culture into the beginning of the development purposefully, and had creatives and artists embedded within the whole working structure of that regeneration. And I think that is a very, very different approach. And I think we need to get much better at having artists and creatives around the table from the beginning, and having their voices in there and having them paid to be in those spaces and places. I am tired of gate crashing things where I'm the only artist and having to constantly bring back the, you know, the thing of what about doing this? It's proven. So I think I'm totally with you on everything around cooperation, co-ops and community, but we need to have artists in those. And we need to have their voices strong in those places. And to begin is beautiful. We shouldn't be waiting for permission and waiting for all the plan to be right and great. The reason the talking shop trials worked is because we just went in there and did it. It's really hard now trying to get the model upscaled, right? Even though we've been proven that it works, but really we just need support to put, I had so many artists asking, how do we take over empty shops? And actually, if we had local authorities, it's happening in Newport, but on a really small level, and they're not being supported. There's already a growth of that area, and people are referring to it as an arts quarter, but it's so lacking in any investment that most of them are shut most of the time. And in order for it to work, it has to be open 6 days a week, if not 7. So
Yeah.
I'll stop now.
No, that's super interesting. You're absolutely right to draw that distinction. And it does, it goes back to one of the points that we expand on in the article that's coming out about sort of cooperative governance of a neighbourhood development. I think one of the things that this would enable, compared to the conventional model of regeneration, which often can only start once there's definitive cash flow, finances in place. There's a lot of sort of holding, waiting for the right moment. There might be opportunities for meanwhile use, but often those are sort of besides the point, because the imperatives driving the development are very much kind of tied to the need for investment returns at a certain point and so on. And so it's quite a linear model that's needed. And when you talk to the likes of Hastings Commons, they talk about a phased, incremental, organic phased development. I think they describe it as, and I think governing something through a cooperative that doesn't need to know it can know what it's trying to do. It can have a sort of a broad mission, but it doesn't need to specify everything up front. It doesn't need to say, okay, we're gonna deliver this many units and that's going to work in this way. I think the scope for kind of incremental change and meanwhile use and creative uses of the space as things are coming forward is much greater under a sort of a relational governance structure like a cooperative. And so I think I could absolutely see an example where you could have local artists embedded in the governance of that and making decisions and really contributing to the overall mission as a sort of joint partner in that stuff. Because you're making it much more relational. It's about conversations and ideas and things can surface. And I think that there's something about the way that these processes and contracts and joint ventures tend to proceed. It is very close to inputs, incremental inputs as things move, and I think I'd 100% agree about the value of arts and creativity in all of that.
Gwen, did you have your hand up?
Sorry, was that me then, Cheryl?
No, not Glen. Gwen. There was a hand up and then it went down again. No, okay, thank you.
Gwen and Gwen is too close together.
Especially in a Sheffield accent.
Is this the time for a break now, Cheryl, for a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Not 5, because there's a really rich discussion, and I think we need to use this space as productively as possible. So shall we break now, Chair?
Yeah, that'd be grand. Thank you. And can I give thanks to everybody for organising this, and also thanks for Teresa for helping us out in the breach.
Thank you, Teresa.
And we'll see you soon.
See you in the second half.